Tēnā tātou katoa e te whānau. Tuatahi mihi atu kia koe apanu, kia kōrua ko here aroha. Nā kōrua i tūwhera i tēnei hui. E whakahaere ana tēnei hui miharo rawa. It's doing its own thing by itself. I didn't touch anything. Engari, he pai tēnei. Ko waiau, he uri tēnei o raukawa ki te kaukaro o Pātitere, whare puhunga, te maunga, manga ōrua, te awa, ko Ngāti Huri, te hapu. Ki te tāotaku kuia, he uri no Ngāpuhi, ko manga muka te marae. No reira, ko Shirley Simmonds tēnei mihi ana ki a koutou. And yes, I'm a mother of two, and yes, this is possibly the first he waka eke noa hui and gathering. My two boys haven't been here. They would have taken great delight in sitting in these two fluffy chairs. Engari, kei konei tonu rawa. They are why I do what I do. And I want to draw on Marama's kupu yesterday, he mukupuna, he tupuna. I think our mukapuna are why we all do what we do. I wanted to, actually last night, doing my last minute review of my presentation, I thought, there's no pictures in there. Graham's presentation was all pictures and heaps of whakaaro hohonu, and I thought, Ngāropi had heaps of pictures of her maunga. I'm going to put my maunga in here. So I wanted to introduce to you my maunga. Ko te whare puhunga o kahukiakia tēnei. We normally refer to our maunga as whare puhunga. I thought one of the first things I think of is that in the full names of our places of significance are our pūrākau. So in our reo is the breadth and the depth of our understandings of who we are. Nō reira, ko te whare puhunga o kahukieke tēnei maunga. Another thing I wanted to share with you was when I was in my teens and, discovering myself and started my journey in reo, and you start learning your pepeha, and I had my little list, what my maunga is, what my awa is, etc. Went to the marae and said, Dad, I said to my dad, okay, so which one's our maunga? And as for some perspective, at Pikitu Marae, we're on a rise out in the rural area, and there's Pitoa Te Ao, Pataruru, and you can see a number of maunga from where we are. There's maunga Tautari. It's a very mountain-looking maunga, very impressive, very jagged, and you have the silhouette on the horizon. In the distance is Titi Raupinga, which has a little, well, not little, obviously, structure at the top, which some of our whānau say looks like a thumb, some say it looks like some other part of anatomy. Anyway, so I asked my dad, which one of these maunga that we see is our maunga? And he took me to the back of our marae and said, over there. And that's what you see from the back of our marae. And I have to admit to feeling a sense of disappointment. I was like, that's a hill. That's a hill, that's just a little slope. And that's our maunga. But as always, our whenua can teach us lessons. So as time went on, I came to learn a number of things about our maunga. One is that from where we stand at Pikitu Marae, you don't quite get the perspective that between here and there's an awa, te awa o Waikato. So I thought that's one of my lessons in life, one of the things I hold. Sometimes there's an awa between where you are and where you want to get to. The other thing I learned was when we first went up onto the maunga, just a few years ago actually. From here you see the left-hand side is all trees, right-hand side is farming. I'd always assumed it was pine forest. And when we got up there, I thought it's ngahere. It's old ngahere with our native trees. And that was a pleasant surprise. So another lesson from my maunga is that things are not always what they seem. And things look differently when you get up close. The other thing I realised from up there was the perspective back onto our marae was totally different. You stand on the top of Te Whare Puhunga or Kaukiekia, and you have this entire expanse of whenua out in front of you, and Piki Marae is a tiny speck. From that vantage point, you can see how our maunga is a maunga tāwharo. So another thought there is that our perspective changes depending on where we are. So I thought I would share that with you, not just to put the one photograph into my presentation, but also to hold these whakaaro as I go through my kōrero on data and the survey and what it has revealed for us as part of this project, as part of this research. Kia ora. And next. That's me. Tuatahi mihi. My role on this project was to facilitate the survey. I have a bit of a background and a bit of experience in quantitative, kaupapa Māori quantitative research, so brought that, and my two boys, into the research. But as I'm doing this, I became, and am consciously, very conscious of those who work at the forefront of our communities. And I know Graham spoke of the ringa raupa, so those of you who have blisters on your hands, blisters on your heart for working at the interface of our communities who are affected by violence of the state, interpersonal violence, but also who have the strength within them to recover and heal. So he mihi nui ki a koutou, I became quite conscious of my distance from that interface and my safe space behind my computer. But I do have to admit to sometimes going through the data and things will jump out at me from the computer and I have to close my laptop and cry. So he mihi nui ki a koutou. Leonie spoke yesterday about data and that, well, first of all, a survey is an interesting tool. So it's a Pākehā tool that we're using for our purposes in this case. And I'll just draw on Graham's kōrero this morning where he said, what evidence? This is one way we can say this evidence. Okay, and we, as a research team, closely critiqued what makes up a survey and ensured every step of the way it fits with our kaupapa Māori principles. And that's important for a number of reasons. Survey and epidemiological data and statistical data is the language of policy. It is how decisions are made about who gets what. And those decisions can facilitate change. So we needed to ensure that the survey design fitted and put first our kaupapa Māori principles, but also was statistically robust, okay, so that we can be challenged about the survey and we have the responses. So at every step of the way, I don't know how many wānanga we had, all on Zoom. Most of it was during, COVID times and lockdowns and so on, but we would wānanga every step along the way. And we've done this before, so we drew on our experience in previous project, the Honour Project Aotearoa, where we also designed a survey using kaupapa Māori principles as the tuapapa, as the foundation. So, Leonie mentioned yesterday that research draws on, and I might be paraphrasing, we just take what the experts tell us. So in the survey here, we're drawing on information given us by whānau in the complete understanding that whānau are the experts, that our families, our whānau, our individual Māori, pakeke, matua, kaumatua, kuia, tamariki, rangatahi, are experts in their own lives. So the survey is designed to gather perspectives from whānau and put it into a shape where we can draw from that expertise. The overall purpose was pretty straightforward, I think, is to identify prevalence of violence and strategies for dealing with violence in amongst our whānau Māori. And that's a point to note. The survey surveyed only Māori. And we have been asked, you know, it would have been interesting to compare Māori and non-Māori. I think Aropi shaking her head. There's a place for that. And as somebody who's worked for, you know, in the past, comparing Māori and non-Māori data, there is a place for that. But here, we wanted our data to stand on its own 2 feet. And it's quite compelling as it is. We used a pie order framework and divided the sections of our survey according to this framework. So, and you'll see it as we go through. We have whānau ora, which are experiences of the collective and experiences on the collective, on our whānau Māori. Mauri ora, where we asked questions around individual experiences of violence. Wai ora, which is sort of as healthy environments. In this case, we looked at access to services. Yeah, you'll see it a little bit more as we go through. And we're hot off a kōrero from Graham, so, you know, what he said. Kaupapa Māori underpinned everything we did in the survey development and its facilitation. One of the key things we wanted to be sure of was that the mana of our respondents was protected as much as possible. The survey was facilitated online, so you're a bit limited in what you can do, but we thought carefully about the order of the questions and also ensured that support services, contact numbers and so on were given there, and also ensured that people who were responding to the survey could just opt out at any point. You know, really conscious that we didn't want to re-traumatise those who had experienced violence. In terms of the methods, like I said, a rigorous process for questionnaire development, and we drew on the expertise of those who worked and have worked in the field for a long time. Online delivery of the survey, it was entirely online, that was a necessity. It was distributed into the field late last year. And like I say, ensuring the mana of respondents was continuously upheld as much as we could do from a distance. So, these are the sections of the survey. The first one we termed kua hau. This is essentially demographic information that you'll get with most surveys. Age, ethnicity, descent, where they are in Aotearoa, gender and sexual identity. One thing to note is that we defined Māori in this case as those who chose Māori as their ethnicity or one of their ethnicities, so self-selected or self-identified as Māori, but also indicated they had descended from Māori. And you might be familiar with those kind of questions. They pop up in the census. Another section, whānau ora, experiences of the collective, Māori ora, experiences of the individual, support and support services, and the last section was on pai ora or aspirational wellbeing, and the huge richness of kōrero came out in that section. So for this morning, and leading us up into morning tea time, I'd like us to have a little look at the demographics, so the profile of those who responded to the survey. One of the things I do want to point out is that we hoped and aimed to get at least 1,000 responses, and you know, you might know it's quite difficult to get people to fill in a survey. Anyone? We're all busy. We designed it so it took about 15 to 20 minutes. Still, that's 15 to 20 minutes of people's time. It can be a burden on our time. So we hoped for around 1,000, and we got approximately or over 1,600 responses. So I just want to pause on that for a moment, because I think a couple of things. I think one thing is that it indicates to us how much our people need to be heard, you know? And I say it's a 15 to 20 minute survey, but some people took meticulous time over filling in the survey and shared some really intimate stories. So really want to acknowledge every single person who partook in the survey. So one thing to note is approximately 80% were female and just under 20% or 17% were male. So that's something to be conscious of as we go through and looking at the results of the survey. It represents largely the voice of wahine Māori. So something to be aware of. Approximately 4% chose to self-describe their gender identity in their own words. So something else just to bear in mind. I do think there's a place or there's a necessity to dig deeper into the needs and experiences of tāne Māori. And we did a little bit on a project Aotearoa, but also for those who choose to self-identify, self-describe their gender in other words. We had a good range of age. The minimum age for filling in the survey was 18. We had up to age 87. And on average, respondents were 49 years and median 50 years. So it's quite a good range. These things are important to kind of ensure that it's a similar profile to the general Māori population. All of them identified that they had Māori ethnicity and descended from somebody who was Māori. 63% of those who answered the survey also identified with at least one other ethnic group, mostly Pākehā. So that gives us a little idea of who answered the survey or the nature of the group. Geographic distribution, all of them were residing in Aotearoa at the time of answering the survey. This colourful map shows where the higher concentration of respondents come from. So where it's red, most of the survey comes from. Probably roughly maps to where our Māori population is concentrated, so that's quite good. But of note, very few or maybe almost none from West Coast and further south, maybe Te Tauihu as well. So the first section I'd like to take a closer look at is the experiences of the collective. Experiences on the collective being whānau, and experiences of the collective. In this section, we largely questioned about state violence, and I think Leonie described it yesterday as state violence being the external forces that impact on whānau and communities. We started with this because of, it sets the context that a lot of our whānau, or all of our whānau, live in. I think Marama spoke about narrative and political violence. So in this set of questions also are questions around experiences of media violence. We had quite a broad definition of state violence. It includes neglect, failure to protect, abuse or abuse of power, racism, breaches of te tiriti, also a separate question around police violence and another separate question around media violence. And our questions ask about lifetime experiences of these violences. And somebody said to me, well, you ask that question, you're going to get like just about everybody saying they've experienced violence. And I thought, well, yes. So question number 1, in your lifetime, have you or your whānau experienced neglect, for example, denial of access to social services from the state or government agencies? This is exactly how the question was worded in the survey. So in the questions are an explanation and description of the violences we're trying to unpack. Respondents were given the options of saying never, we've never experienced it, a few times or a lot. So it's quite a crude measurement, but it gives us an overall picture of lifetime experiences. So in all this data here, you'll see the dark blue is where they've said a lot, medium blue a few times, and light blue is never. So approximately 1/3 of respondents said they've never experienced neglect from state or government agencies. However, 2/3 have said yes. And just over 20% said they have experienced this a lot. Of course, it's dependent on requiring access to these, but I guess most of us do at some point require access. A follow-up question was asked by which of the following, and these are the top 5 in order of the number of responses received: health system, WINS, education, police, and the justice system. Others were given as well. What came up in the other section, what came up a lot was ACC. And other things came up. Because this is lifetime experience, some people put the old names for different services as well. So they came up in there, and they're in the deeper analysis that we put in our report. Question number 2, in your lifetime, have you or your whānau experienced a failure to protect by the state or government agencies? Just over a third said never, and just under 2/3 says yes, and approximately 17% said a lot. So a failure to protect by the services that are designed to protect us. By which of the following? Number 1 that came up was police, health, justice system, education, and WINS. And in the other section, again, ACC featured quite highly, and other individual government agencies were named. So things like Māori Land Court, I'm looking at my notes here, births, deaths and marriages, that organisation. What else have we got? OTS. So a number of other things were named as well. These were the top 5, if you like. Top 5 makes it sound like something to celebrate. I don't know. If someone's got another term, you can throw it out there. Worst 5, yeah. In your lifetime, so question number 3, have you or your whānau experienced abuse or abuse of power from the state or government agencies? 28% said never, and the remainder said yes. Just over 20% said a lot. So abuse or abuse of power from state or government agencies. So power is something that's come up a lot in this last day or so, and I've been thinking quite a lot about that. I'm still working on it, but I just wanted to make that note at this point, because I think I'll come back to it. The West 5, by which of the following? Police again, health system, justice system, education, or rangatamariki. And again, there are a number of comments in the other section that said, named SIFs, for example, that were picked up in the free text section. In your lifetime, have you or your whānau experienced racism from the state or government agencies? And this time, a considerably smaller proportion stated never. So just 17%, and over a third stated a lot. So I think that's quite compelling in itself. By education system, health system, police, WINS, justice system. I think it's the same 5 coming up again in slightly different orders. ACC came up again in that too. So some comments. So in the survey, and to give respondents the option to have their voice, in the survey we put anything else, and any others at the bottom of every option list that we gave them. It's a bit of a catch-22 thing, because we want to give respondents voice and the option to have their say, but in terms of analysis, it's a huge amount of analysis. But we've worked through the most of it. These are some of the comments that came up in this section. My sons have been stopped by the police and felt the only reason was because of their colour. I may have, but it's hard to identify when you don't see it coming. Having people not believe that I'm Māori, like I have to prove it. Subtly, in a way that they think I will not notice. Everywhere. In your lifetime, have you or your whānau experienced breaches of te tiriti or waitangi from the state or government agencies? Again, a small proportion stated never, 17%. Almost 44% stated a lot, which is huge. And I think one of the interesting things about this question, it's very dependent on the individual recognising a breach of te tiriti. So my thinking is it's probably an undercount of those experiences. The list is a bit different here. If you think we're asking about breaches of te tiriti, so by which of the following? Customs and Immigration, District or Regional Council, Department of Conservation, and also Education and Health. So what's different here, I think, is partly those who deal with our whenua, who we have to have dealings with in order to maintain our role as kaitiaki of our whenua. And some of the comments in the open text other section. This is a difficult question. These organisations are all built on white supremacy and so are inherently racist. Yeah, good point. The effects of colonisation are ongoing. Loss of land, loss of language, displacement, poverty and violence. The legacy of colonisation is ongoing. And we know that. I look around the room, I see everyone's heads nodding. And I just want to draw on what Matua Graham said this morning. Yes, it's ongoing. It's also morphing, isn't it? It's changing and we need to keep up with it. No Māori sovereignty, still waiting for that. Disregard for preserving the mauri of whenua and water. And that hits us hard, we know that. Breaches every day from any government department and agencies. Breaching the treaty is a norm. And yesterday I think Marama talked about there was lots of kōrero about the internalisation of violence in us as individuals, but also in our system. So this is an indication that that type of violence is very normalised in our system. Big breath. In your lifetime, so as a separate question, in your lifetime, have you or your whānau experienced police violence? Just under half said never, but again, it's dependent on requiring an encounter with the police or requiring the police services. A few times and 9% stated a lot. And so following that series of questions, we asked a general question around system violence impact on your well-being. And you would have noticed all the questions asked about you or your whānau, and the knowledge that a violence on one of your whānau members is a violence in yourself. And I think Leonie said, a violence on a whanaunga is also a violence on your whakapapa. So impacts on the collective. So this question, in general, how much does it impact on your well-being? So just 20% said not at all. And as we go further down the survey, we might get a bit of an insight to that there. So just sort of mark that place. But about half said some, and nearly a third said a lot. So state or system violence impacts a lot on a third of the respondents' well-being. Okay, so this is heaps of words, but I'll read it out. I wanted to share this, so this is in the free text section of that particular question. I wanted to share this one quote. This is one quote. And so that's what I mean about people really took the time in this survey. But there's a lot in this one quote, and it covers a lot of what the rest of the survey comes out with. You have to expect Pākehā British colonial racism and violence at all times and in any place, and be prepared to defend yourself. You have to measure your response to provocations as Pākehā set up Māori to be entrapped so they can profit. You have to accept the colonial system is designed to drive you insane and abuse you for British race profit, and that we've all been conditioned to accept it, and that some Pākehā champion racist abuse and theft. You have to study how we've been manipulated into this position and potential ways out. You have to accept some Māori have been colonised to support abusive colonial institutions and culture, and that some may hide behind the language of mana motuhake for profit. You have to seek those who care and fight for tino rangatiratanga, mana motuhake, and hold on to your whakapapa and mātauranga Māori, no matter where abusers come from. You have to realise other Māori are being hammered by this continued racist colonial violence, and that they may be losing their minds too. You have to use whatever tools you can hold on to kaupapa Māori integrity and the idea that your wairua and whakapapa have eternal value. Ka whawhai tonu mātou ake, ake, ake. So I think that quote is really profound, and it holds a lot of what we've heard in these last couple of days and a lot of what we know. So this is still the same question, and we've done because you in the free text, like I mentioned, you give a free text option for whānau, they give their voice, and you get 1,600 responses. So we've done a thematic analysis of these in this instance. So the question was, are there things you do to try and minimise the impact of state violence in your life? For those who answered yes, we asked what are they? And we've roughly grouped them into these. So some boundaries, avoid, disengage. Try not to rely on the system for anything. Adherence to rules and laws, conform, I keep my nose clean. Attempt to fit in as Pākehā and act like I'm Pākehā. And ka aroha. Education and system navigation. Educate myself and my whānau on what we are entitled to. So a lot of comments came back with, I teach my tamariki, I teach my mokopuna, how to navigate the system. Advocacy support, take trustworthy people with me. Yeah. And we heard a lot yesterday, they're not safe spaces. Self-advocacy and education, exercise my rights, complaints letters. So I was actually really quite encouraged to hear a number of times this came out, people really strongly advocating, and not surprised because I don't believe that we have it in us, but like pleasantly surprised because it's exhausting. So it's really encouraging to hear that a number of people are doing that, but do want to acknowledge that it's draining. There's a mental, emotional and wairua load that comes with having to do that. Tikanga, connection, communication. I try to connect with my hapu. Ka mautonu au ki aku tikanga me toku reo, karakia. And we'll see this theme coming up again and again throughout the duration of the survey. Rangatiratanga, live in our whenua with our rules. That's the answer. Ne. So that question, are there things you try to do to minimise the impact of state violence in your life? These were those who said yes. Those who said no. Ironically, interestingly, a lot of the answers were the same. So, no, I don't do anything to minimise the impact, but I do this. So it just shows how prevalent it is that we've made these changes to our life to exist in the system. So the themes that came up here were avoid, disengage, seek tautoko, and communication is really important, talking things through, advocacy, resistance, change, working on your own health, a real strong focus on your health and the health of your whānau, and I think that's resilience, isn't it? Heightened awareness, so this was a little bit different from the previous slide, heightened awareness, hypervigilance, and preparedness. And we saw that in that big quote a couple of slides back. Another thing that was a bit different in these responses, those who are Pākehā passing and acknowledging the privilege in the system that comes with that. So some responses came up with, I'm a white passing Māori, so I try to use my privilege to protect and look out for my whānau. Some responses came up with that they were unsure how to minimise the impact. So it affects us, we don't know how or what to do about it. I don't know where to ask for help and very hard to trust others with so much discrimination and racisms in the community, and those people hide behind happy masks. And yes, that's racism's plural, and I left it in there. I mean, it's quote for quote, it's word for word, but I just want to go back to, was it Marama who said yesterday? Cheryl said yesterday about viewing colonial racism different from racism in general. Yeah. So there are different types of racisms. It's not a typo, I believe. Change is unlikely or powerless or futility, so having that sort of sense of futility. Have given up asking for help. I have come to terms with SIFs failing me. There's nothing I can do until there is systemic change. Feel helpless. What can you do? So, a further question, and this is on the media. In your lifetime, how often have you or your whānau experienced the following types of violence from media? So again, we had quite a in-depth definition of the types of violence that the media can enact, and they're there in the bottom, along the bottom there, but I'll read them out. So to interpret this graph, they're all 100%. The dark bars, again, are those who indicated they experienced this a lot. Medium blue is a few times, and down the bottom of each bar is the light blue, which is those who indicated they have never experienced this. So types of violence: negative portrayals of Māori, nearly 78% said a lot, only 3.6% said they had never experienced this. Racist comments about Māori, 77% stated a lot. Negative media slant on news stories, 77%, again, a lot. 3.5% stated they'd never experienced this. Negative and abusive comments on Te Tiriti o Waitangi, 73%, a lot. 4.4%, never. Negative and abusive comments about Māori language or culture, 75%, a lot. 3%, never. Aggressive or threatening posts on social media. So a point to note, we've used media here in terms of the news media or any media that we're exposed to, but also included social media. Aggressive or threatening posts on social media, 60% a lot, it's 10% never. Again, this question is dependent on how often or how much you engage with social media. Homophobia in the media, from the media, 40.6% a lot, 21.5% never. Again, I think that question's very dependent on you being receptive to those, to homophobia in the media. And following that question, which, pulled apart the different types of violences from the media, we asked a general question. In general, how much does media violence impact your well-being? Just 11% said not at all. Over half said some, and over a third said a lot. And this is a question that flushed out a lot of interesting responses. So again, an open text question. Are there things you do to minimise the impact of media violence? We can probably predict what some of these responses will be. So of just over 1,300 responses, 87% said yes. And these were some of the strategies. So again, avoid, put boundaries in place, or disengage. I'm in control of what I expose myself to. Self-selecting positive Māori media, which shows the importance of our positive Māori media. Follow culturally positive and inspiring people. Shows the importance, too, of our role models on social media. You think of the influencers, challenge or lodge complaints, speak out against it as often as I can, write more positive stories myself. So these are types of activism. Keep informed, empower myself on facts about our true Māori history. Kōrero, the importance of talking it through, sharing and connecting, discuss it with family. We find solace in that sharing and knowing we're not the only ones that are experiencing this. And some of the comments acknowledged the power of the media and acknowledged the impact it can have. So even the positive news stories have hateful racist comments, and these make me angry and cry. Again, a big breath. This is, it's taumaha mahi. But as I present this, I see you all nodding around the room, and I know we know this. I thought what we'd do, let's check my time, 15 minutes or so. I think I'd like to hear from you. So having gone through some of that data, what I'd like us to do, take about, 8 minutes, I'm looking at our timekeeper, on your tables and just have some kōrero about what's been presented here this morning. Have a think. What are your thoughts on the definitions we've used of state violence and maybe also media violence? Sing out if you want me to flick back through some of the slides. Does the data here reflect your experience or the experience in your mahi? Any thoughts on that? And does it, at this point, provide some steps towards solutions? I just, again, hark back to Matua Graham's kōrero this morning. We want to be continually moving forward, part of the solution. I'm totally paraphrasing you, but it needs to be transformative, doesn't it? So have a think about that. I'll turn to Hiri Aroha for timekeeping, but about 8 minutes in our tables, and then I'd like us to hear from some of the tables before we go for morning tea. Kia ora.
Ka pai, and we want to hear from each table. So we'll start right at the back here.
Okay, now? Okay.
Okay, here we go. It's going to be a speed response, and every table gets to respond for 30 seconds, and I will cut you off if you go too long. So no kouwhau whānau.
Ka pai. Kia ora, Shirley. Thank you for your kōrero. We had a couple of kōrero discussions here about education, but I had a pātai about intersectionality. So I know you asked about sexual orientation in your one of the pātai. Why is that question asked, and is there an opportunity for some more analysis into the intersections of violence beyond gender and ethnicity, like gender identity and sexual identity?
I'll answer that later, but
Ka
good
pai.
pātai.
Thank you.
Ka pai, that was done in 20 seconds. So the ana te taumata. Next table, kia ora.
Kia ora tātou. We talked a little bit about social media, and it was pointed out that the age range of the participants probably affected what media they felt more impacted by, that if there'd been younger participants, you might have seen more impact from social media. And we also talked about how easy it is to get banned from social media for responding to racism. That's more likely to get you banned than the racism is.
Kia ora. Next table.
It's all right, I'm taking good notes.
Tēnā koutou katoa, Wotira. We just spoke briefly about personal experiences of violence in our families, in our communities, and some of the phrases that are coming up these days that some of us are not quite sure where they come from. For example, we talked about the phrase unashamedly Māori or unapologetically Māori. And for some of us it was, what the hell is that? So for some of us, we've never felt the need to apologise for being who we are. And on that note, we'll move it to the next table.
Okay, I'll reset.
Kia ora whānau. So our table didn't really quite get onto this, but we kind of were talking about it in a roundabout way. So we were talking about our engagements with government agencies, trying to ensure that kaupapa Māori perspective is, part of the conversations, but they have this way of listening but not actually listening, and so you have to repeat yourself like 10 million times, say the same stuff. And I think that was it, eh? And then trying to push through sort of a by Māori, for Māori sort of definitions, and then taking it and...
Next tip.
Okay. I'm not very good at speed dating, I'm out of practice.
Kia ora. We at our table spoke of a privilege of being a kaupapa Māori service and the vehicle we have to make change, and looking at reflecting on the data and what we can do to make that change happen.
Ka pai. Next.
Kia ora koutou. So the data is exactly what our whai order experienced. So for us, it was also around the prevalence of health situated quite high in the data, and then the mahi that we're doing here and the structural racism that exists for organisations that go in to work with them. So I think there's there's a lot of mahi to do. But yes, it's exactly what our whānau have experienced. So yeah, kia ora.
Kia ora tātou, ngā mihi kia tātou. I guess basically we all felt that what's reflected in the data is pretty much our realities that we see from our whānaus every day. Also about how we empower whānau to have the tools to be able to talk to and articulate what their rights are, what their entitlements are. We have one of our whai here talked about, our whānau have gone beyond the place of whakamā, but whakamā is definitely the place.
Kia ora, te tuakana. Moving to this back table.
Kia ora tātou. So Aotearoa briefly spoke about the whānau that we work with and how they don't have faith with those agencies that were mentioned, and we weren't surprised at the data. Koina.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. There's only two of us, and she went wharepaku, but but I'd just like to say that the media, I feel, has got a big thing on what people think and what people, media itself, for me, has has caused a lot of racism towards Māori. We get this wrong perspective because obviously news sells. So it's just Māori seems to get dragged through the mud every time. So
That was a nice
kia ora.
wānanga with yourself while the whananga was in the wharepaku. Apai i tuku.
Kia ora te wānau. First, we agreed that the violence is probably undercounted. We thought that the results validated our lived experience and held a mirror up to government agencies, and hope there's an opportunity to make change there. Also on the intersectionality, I was wondering about where people lived versus where they wakapapa, and if there was anything there. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
On the spot. Kia ora koutou. Ko Violet Cheney. We spoke about the barriers and how a lot of our whānau really whakamā and that shame that they carry, and how difficult it is to actually be Māori, especially if you're white, and that you don't experience the same violence going into a lot of our services because you don't have the name that goes with it or the skin colour. So you're fine until you're on the other side or you're supporting somebody that is Māori and you see the difference in how you're treated and how your whānau are treated. So there's power there for you to create change and be staunch in that space. Yeah, I think that's
Tēnā
it. Kia ora.
Tuku te rākau.
Kia ora tātou. I'm just going to summarise some of the kōrero here, which was basically that there's some amazing people in the room, and a lot of us agree, and the speeches have talked to the need to do some, movement in regards to calling out and addressing the state violence. We do a lot with our whānau on the ground, but actually, why don't we do more and regenerate a movement and acknowledge all the good stuff that's already been done in the movement to address state violence, because enough is enough. Kia ora.
Kia ora Zoe.
You guys.
Oh, kia ora. We were just surprised about the low amount of, I think, stats of impacts on whānau wellbeing, and we just wondered if this was possibly because of either whānau are desensitised or have a high tolerance of the acceptance of this. So, yeah, just a question really of, around that. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Thanks, whānau. Kia ora koutou. At our tepu, part of our kōrero was around
how these experiences are quite normal for the whānau that we work with, and they don't recognise for what it is. So a lot of that role for kaimahi is calling it out so that that internalisation isn't continuing on, and like acknowledging the behaviour as racist and discrimination, so that it's actually not our whānau that issue is, it's the issue with the system, with the service that they are interacting with.
Ka pai. Can we just come back this way? We've got 3 tables here and then we'll go back over that side.
Tēnā tātou. Firstly, he mahi nui, great to see some research around social media and whānau Māori, because there's just nothing really, not much out there. For us, it was really amazing to see how whānau, like especially with social media, because that's current and developing, how they are developing their own tikanga. Nobody had to go and help them do these things. So that was really great, and I hope we can get that slide, because it's a good little pack we can give out to whānau as well. We talked about...
Okay, 2 seconds.
Well, we talked about the numbing, or the coping responses that perhaps some of the whānau have desensitised or numbed themselves, and to us that was exampled with education, because the majority of our tamariki are still in mainstream schools, and we're still sending our babies into these really detrimental environments where they are encountering blatant and subtle racism on a daily basis. So this kind of shows that there's a need to get a bit woke. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, no, over here, sorry.
Kia ora koutou. Yes, our Tēpuru talked about social media being a breeding ground for racism, and how sometimes that racism and state violence can be explicit and implicit. So we were thinking of coming up with a solution around maybe educating our whānau more on what they're experiencing on social media platforms. Yeah, kia ora.
Okay, moving down to this end, and the tables are between time and after a morning tea. Oh, jeez. You still get 30 seconds.
Oh, hikama. Kia ora. We just reflected on the data and the social media, and also just reflected around education system and how the system employs kaupapa Māori people, but sometimes at the top it's Pākehā, and how that impacts coming through and coming down to our kids.
Kia ora koutou. Just want to mihi and say I love data, and this was amazing data, so kia ora. I think we talked a lot about too that the findings obviously didn't surprise our table, but also probably talked about or sort of showed the normalisation that our whānau experience with state violence in general, that it's just normalised and that the media continues to normalise that violence. And I just want to say, when I'm on Reddit, I report every racist comment. Every racist comment on RNZ, I do that. So yeah, kia ora.
Awesome. Kia ora tātou. Our Tēpū discussed the homophobia statistic that was up on the board, and we were curious about how that reflected in the data in terms of trans and non-binary folk, and how in that small percentage of people who describe their own identity as curious about how they're misgendered through state processes in school, and how misgendering is an act of violence. I think we got a bit more in depth than that, but I'm really hating having the microphone. So just to tautoko what the first table said about intersectionality. Okay, we've got 2 more tables. Yep. Oh, back of the room.
Huri noa, e rauranga tira mā, tēnā koutou. Kia koe, mō tō kōrero whakahirahira, e whakaturia ki a mātou, tēnā koe. Haere tonu, kauri mai rātu tapu whenua, mai tuahuriri, kei konei rātu, anei mātou, Te ahi kai kaura tama ki te rangi. Right. Anyway, to summarise, table 1, table 3, table 4, table 5. No one went to the wharepaku, but anyway, we talked about how we have to school up our kids to deal with racism, what definitions of racism are, because apparently saying kia ora, Pākehās will lose their language and they'll lose their land and their culture. We talked about having to advocate for our kaumātua in those organisations. So organisational structures are barriers for our people, the interaction between staff to our people, and of course socio-economic factors. Kia ora. And we don't have a table. So.
Kia ora. Our table discussed the percentage of no's across the board, and we were quite surprised by that, whether that was through disengagement, avoidance or boundaries. And we discussed what that would look like across all boards. How many Māori have chosen to disengage as a result of racism or mistreatment. So that was, that's what we kind of discussed. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Final table over here.
Appreciating the kōrero and the data that has been gathered, and we know it's more, shining up our own eyes, and how do we take this into the mahi with our whānau.